Hello and welcome. The coronavirus has brought the world to a halt. What's the best way of bringing our economy back to life? In a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous or VUCA world, how do we revive our financial and industrial systems from the ICU they've been sent into? Joining us live from Boston is one of the world's leading economists, former Chief Economic Advisor in the Government of India and visiting lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. My guest today is Dr. Arvind Subramanian. Dr. Subramanian, welcome to India today. I want to start by understanding from you your ideas, your framework on the ways of minimizing the loss to health, human life and the economy now that we've been struck by COVID-19.
Yeah, Rahul, thanks for having me on the program. Shall we begin by discussing, why, this is such a, kind of different situation that, India and the world find themselves in compared to anything else we've seen in the past? I think perhaps that's the right starting point.
Sure, I'm happy to start from wherever you want. Why don't you explain why we're in a very, very volatile, very uncertain, very different scenario from what we've seen, and how should we be dealing with it?
Right. See, I think, first of all, let's step back and look at it, globally, and then let's come to India after that, right? I think that when we think about financial crises, and economic crises of this sort, we have a certain benchmark or a frame of reference, and that in this case it happens to be the global financial crisis, because that was the big shock that the world experienced 12 years ago. But this crisis is just completely different from that in just so many ways. To start with, that was a crisis that affected one country, the United States, and spread to the rest of the world. In this crisis, you have because of all the social distancing measures and the health costs that have happened, it's a crisis in every major country, much bigger than the global financial crisis. So it's like instead of one big shock, we have about 50 big shocks, and they kind of interact with each other, magnify each other. So it's just a much, much bigger a crisis that we find all across the world. It's also very uncertain because, we don't know how long, the pandemic is going to last, what the transmission is going to be, how many people are going to die. And the other big uncertainty, it's almost like if you read science fiction, there's a great book by Isaac Asimov called Nightfall. I think the whole, how will society respond to these measures? We just don't know. For example, we've seen in India as well, we're not sure how long we can impose the lockdown, how much people can take. So society's tolerance for this is also very uncertain to predict. The third thing, of course, which I think economists talk about a lot, is that this is not a crisis like in the past where, something happens and then the government says, let's cut interest rates, let's inject money, and, the economy, we can kind of revive the economy back again, because this is not that kind of shock. You don't want to revive the economy in a sense because, the non-essential sectors have to shut down. You can't go back to status quo ante for a very long time. So our responses have to be much more tailored to the situation, and that's and this is completely uncharted waters. We've never been here before. We used to thinking about, oh, something happens, government pumps in more money, and we get the economy back again. You fix the financial system, and this is so very different from that. I think. If we could now move on to India, why?
So why don't you explain to us, Dr. Subramanian, in what ways?
Respond to in India.
In what ways, according to you, is the problem the same globally, and in what ways does India have very specific vulnerabilities or specific issues that Indian policymakers and the Indian government and the Indian public need to look at more carefully?
Yeah, I think, see, the Indian situation, I think, is different from the global situation in, I would say, at least, three ways, let's say. For example, the first is the health dimension of this pandemic. And here, I think we're on a knife edge. Honestly, we don't really know the trajectory of the pandemic in India. Yeah, and the reason is that India has, I think, at least two or three differences, which could take it either way. For example, it could make it less severe, it could make it more severe. And, I'm not a health expert enough to know which way it's going to go. For example, there's much more density in India. Our health capacity is kind of much weaker. Our ability to respond is therefore more limited. And therefore, that could make the crisis just like in advanced countries, but with a lag of 2-3 weeks, in which case I think it's going to be very serious in India. But on the other hand, it's possible that we have some immunity against it because of BCG. Temperatures work in our favor, and therefore transmission is lower. We have a younger population, fatalities could be lower. So we just don't know. But I think as a matter of policy, we should be prepared for, a more extreme, and that's how I think India has responded. To give credit to the government, they've said lockdown, very serious. So they have acted on a kind of precautionary basis, as they should, because India could, in principle, be very, very severe. So that's the first different aspect. The second aspect, I think, from the economy point of view, which is very different, is that remember that India was not a kind of economy that was chugging along like many economies, and suddenly this hit. You will recall that I did some work with Josh Fellman. We wrote a paper saying that even if you look at November, December, all of last year, the economy was slowing down considerably. So this is not a shock that's affecting a strong economy. This affecting an economy that was already slowing down considerably because of problems in the financial sector and so on. So in a sense, so it's like a double whammy for India from an economic point of view. I think the third difference with other economies is that we are a poorer country compared to the US and other countries. So not just our ability to respond to health, but our ability to cushion the people affected by this is going to be more limited. Our resources are more limited. And so that's going to kind of shape how we respond. And I think one dimension which we've discovered where India is actually quite unique is that we have lots of people in the informal sector, lots of vulnerable people. We saw that with the migrant kind of community where suddenly they turned out to be, and our ability to reach them easily and effectively is not as good as advanced countries. So these things are going to shape now how the government has responded and how we should respond going forward.
So let's break this up into two parts.
On the health side and on the economic side,
I'm keen on understanding from you, Dr. Subramanian. In your view, what do you make of what the government's already done? In the short run, what more would you like to see the government do to try and mitigate the economic loss and the human loss of coronavirus?
Right. I think, look, you go in a situation like this, you go to bat with the social safety net you have. Now, what are the kind of the 2 or 3 big dimensions of our ability to provide this social insurance, this cushion for the vulnerable? We have the PDS. I think there the government has quite rightly both expanded the rations and also said you can also not just wheat and rice, but also pulses and other crops. I think that we should do. It's a very good first step. Maybe depending upon the duration of the crisis, maybe we should even increase that further as we go along. So I think that's a very commendable first step. I think the second big thing that part of the social safety net that we've created, and that's a tribute to the government, that the whole JAM plumbing, Jandhan, Aadhaar Mobile, about 38 crore people in India have Jandhan accounts. I think there we should be much more generous than we have been so far. See, so far the cash transfer dimension of the government's actions have been somewhat small and kind of accelerating forward what we were going to do in any case. And also it's kind of targeting, farmers, women, etc. I think at this stage, the one I think big thing I would say is that we should be much more on the side of generosity on these cash transfers. I think, for example, we should just send it to all the Jan Dhan accounts, because this is not the time to be, trying to get very sophisticated about the targeting. We can't, doesn't matter if we, give it to some people who are rich or who are salaried, who don't need it. What we don't want to do is miss out on people who deserve it. And targeting has this thing. You say, okay, everyone with BPL cards will get this, then lots of poor people don't have BPL cards. So I think we should, in terms of scope, just pump money into Jan Dhan accounts, maybe increase the magnitudes, and also depending upon how it goes out, maybe do it for 3-6 months rather than a shorter duration. So I think generosity on the cash transfers, erring on that is something I think we should do.
But the government is also having to deal with very serious revenue generation constraints, because industrial activity is down to the minimal. That government revenues are stretched, and at a time, sitting on the outside, it's easy to say, open your purse strings, give the money that you have. Those within the system will say, we're doing the best that we can. We have very serious revenue constraints. What are your ideas on trying to overcome those revenue constraints in the short term?
Yeah, so I think, Rahul, it's absolutely fair to say that, we have revenue constraints, and, we don't want to be irresponsible as a result of that. But I would say a couple of things, right? I think compared to many economies, I think certainly many developing economies, we have perhaps more fiscal space than I think some would argue. Just let's work with some numbers, Rahul, just to be concrete, if that's okay with you.
Oh, absolutely.
I think the size of the initial government package has been about, I would say about 1% of GDP, and I think that's it's a very, very good start. My own view, just based on very rough calculations, is that if you factor in the health costs, because remember, Rahul, if whatever we need to do on the health side, whether it's testing or vaccines or buying all this equipment, I think everyone would agree that those things, providing protection to our health personnel, providing protection to all those people who are in the supply chain, who can make sure that the food from the farm can come to the kirana stores and markets, all those people in the front line, and the government has taken very good action, to protect them medically. All of us as a society will agree that we should not at all, hold back on those expenditures. I think everyone would agree with that. So I think we need to do that, but also we need to cushion those who've been affected, and that's where the economic dimension. So I would say one, we can on a one-off basis borrow more from the public. On a one-off basis, we can also resort to more monetary financing. And I think also I would say that there are things we can do, like in the piece that we wrote, Devesh Kapoor and I wrote. I think we could create, for example, a solidarity fund based on one-off, taxes, or on, remember, the salaried and the wealthy are not being hit by this, the people in the informal sector. So I think there can be raising of solidarity money. And my calculation is that on a one-off basis, a combination of a little bit more issuing bonds, some printing money, raising some solidarity thing, all on a one-off basis, I think can be financed.
One of the big challenges that I'd like to hear your thoughts on is dealing with urban laborers. Now, farmers generally have had a few rounds of the Kisan Yojana coming into their accounts, so we've got them mapped. We've had previous instances of money being targeted into their accounts. Urban laborers are largely out of the realm of any form of social security in India. this is a crisis. You can't now start going door to door, taking a list, figuring out who to put on a list. How do we deal with the challenges posed by urban laborers?
Yeah, I think firstly, remember that, whether it's PM Kisan or BPL thing, you know, uh, I don't think I would go so far as to say we've got it covered and, our targeting is perfect or whatever. I think there are lots of, still gaps in our ability to reach these people. And you're absolutely right that that gap is perhaps greatest when it comes to urban migrant workers. So I think that, remember, that's why if you transfer money into Jan Dhan accounts, you're likely to, also transfer more to these migrant workers as well, because they're likely to have accounts where they are or accounts back home. I think that's one. I think Kerala has done a reasonably, been creative about how providing shelter, providing cooked food. And remember, so which leads me to, I think, one aspect I want to emphasize here is that we tend to think of these things very much from the center point of view, but a lot of the action on the front line is going to be taken by the states. So whatever we say, we have to give more freedom and more resources to the states, because they are at the front line. They can be more creative, they can be more nimble, whether it's the migrant workers in Delhi or in Surat, or parts of southern India. I think the states need to see, because at the moment, remember, the states are also under these, fiscal constraints imposed by their fiscal responsibility legislations. We don't want them to feel that, they cannot spend because there are all these, constraints on them imposed. So I think for this year, at least, we should relieve the burden of these straitjackets on states and allow them to spend more, much more to deal, including with this problem of migrant labor.
I want to shift our attention to the more organized economy. Now, the economy isn't an electricity switch you can simply turn on and off. As of now, industrial activity has come to a screeching halt. What's the best way of springing back to life? How can we turn this adversity into opportunity?
Yeah, see, for one thing, I think we've spoken so far just about, the informal sector and those who've been hit very badly. But I think some of the actions that the Reserve Bank of India have taken are exactly the right ones. One thing you need to do at this stage is make sure that, firms can survive, both the small and medium enterprises and the large firms. So all the kind of, the debt moratoria, not having to pay debt, keeping, their access to money going, both for the small firms and the large firms. I think keeping them, because what we don't want them to do is to kind of go under now and sort of halt in a way that they will not be in a position to come back when the kind of economy snaps back. So keeping, again, we may have to err on the side of, being generous, small and medium enterprise, large enterprises not having to, keep paying loans, giving them liquidity, allowing them to, have more NPAs for some time, for example. I think just keeping them afloat at this stage as much as possible is kind of, I think the way you prepare them to come back when the economy recovers. Now, Rahul, there's the problem here, of course, is going to be, and this is something that all economies are facing, that and this is particularly acute in India, I would say. We've spoken, I've written and others have written famously about, the 4C problem in India. See, at this stage, you want money to go to, all kinds of, the organized sector, all firms in the organized sector. But if bankers, because of, the fear of, CBI, CVC, ED, whatever courts, they may be much more cautious to making this, because, 6 months down the road or 1 year down the road, they may be told, how come you provided money to this, obviously, insolvent company, and so all those allegations. So I think a big part of, I think, our challenge is also going to be to reassure bankers, reassure people in the financial system that at this stage, whatever they do, that they will not be subject to arbitrary kind of action down the road. I think that's a very important point, because I think in India, as you know, there is this fear of the four C's that has held back credit in the past, and that's going to be particularly acute now, because remember, you're going to have to make loans to companies that are kind of floundering and not in a good situation. And so that reassurance, the policy reassurance that, it's okay. Yep, sorry.
Dr. Subramanian, weekly jobless claims in the United States have shot through the roof, reaching levels which weren't even seen during world wars. In India, companies are grappling with a very serious problem. Businesses across sectors have been hit. Managements are forced to think about shutting down the more vulnerable parts of their empires, while there are employees who've been on payrolls are now very concerned about what happens into the future. What can we do as a collective to try and mitigate the damage? Some bloodbath will be inevitable. How do you try and minimize that?
See, I think one principle for the formal sector, which I think it's kind of more like the European approach to this than the American approach, and I think we can afford this because our organized sector is much smaller, is that I think the support to firms in India should be conditional on, maintaining their employment, maintaining employees, maintaining payroll. Because remember, a principle for this is that you don't want to make temporary problems permanent. You sack people, and then, when the economy comes back again, there are going to be all these costs in getting them back again, retraining them, etc., etc. So one principle for minimizing that would be to say to help firms, but to say that conditional on not reducing employment. I think that's a principle that Europe has followed. I think it's something that we can afford to, because the organized sector is much smaller in India than elsewhere.
You also speak about how we could use this crisis and turn it into an opportunity to fix some of the larger structural problems that face us as a country. So in conclusion, I want you to focus, Dr. Subramanian, on what can be done to try and fix the structural problems that we face using the circumstances that this crisis has created.
Yeah, I think, Rahul, this is a really important point, because, at the moment we're in the thick of the crisis, but I think it does open up, many possibilities. One, I would say, we've made a great start with our JAM, which I think the Prime Minister and the government deserve a lot of credit for. I think completing that, because there are still gaps in this, completing that, paving the way for a universal basic income in the future, that's something that we can do. One. Second, very important, Make in India, one of the Prime Minister's flagship programs, has had very mixed success. But I think now we've realized that, something like pharmaceuticals, why should we be dependent on the rest of the world and China? So we should go on a war footing to revive Make in India, initially with, I think, the pharmaceutical sector, just go on a war footing, so that India can make the active, what's called the API, get together with industry, have a plan, have a revived pharmaceutical sector. We can use this opportunity, I think, to do that. Similarly, I think, our macro fiscal framework, all our targets, everything have gotten a little bit outdated. I think, next year's budget will have to be significantly viewed. I just said, all the fiscal responsibility, targets are becoming a little bit less meaningful. I think revisiting that whole framework, I think is going to be very important as well. Similarly, I think it's an opportunity in the agricultural sector. If our JAM plumbing can be good, we can maybe move away from subsidies and do more direct benefit transfers, and really increase the efficiency of the Indian agriculture, improve supply chains by this. Last point I would make, I think, and there are many others as well. I think this whole question of a national solidarity fund. I mean, can we be thinking about better taxation, more efficient, more rational taxation, in a way that both raises resources for the crisis, but also puts in place a much better, more equitable, fair, efficient tax system for the future? I think it's a great opportunity for that as well.
You know, we have seen over the past 20 odd minutes immense clarity in economic thinking, and there's some very sharp ideas that policymakers could potentially build on. For joining us from the Harvard Kennedy School, Dr. Arvind Subramanian, and for your thoughts in such a structured fashion on where we're at and what we could be doing to try and minimize the damage. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you, sir.